The bell tolls at midnight. Greetings. I'd like to welcome all of my midnight marauders. Come on in, get comfy, and lend me your imagination. There was a new family moving next door to nosy neighbor Ceilia Greedly, who resided in a quaint Lake Havasu home on Cinder Block Road. Ceilia was known as the most chattery busybody one could ever have the misfortune of striking up a conversation with in a line at the grocery store. Those who knew her dodged her like a game of dodgeball in a high school gym upon seeing her walking their way. Why, you might ask? Because 2 hours and 15 minutes later, she'd still have you helplessly trapped in a non-stop conversation about how to grow tomatoes in your backyard. Oh, the agony this lady had bestowed upon the good people of Cinder Block Road. But this particular Friday seemed to be her lucky day. The time was 3:30 p.m. and Ceilia was in the kitchen whipping up a meatloaf dinner for her family. Her 44-year-old husband, Parker, and 15-year-old son, Kyle, both hated Celia's meatloaf. It was probably due to the fact that she put apples in it for an extra oomph, as she liked to say. Ceilia heard the rumbling of a car outside her kitchen window. Curious, she hurried over to the window with a look of eagerness and excitement on her face. Time to see who bought the old Peterson house next door, she excitedly said to herself as she quickly but carefully opened the blinds just enough to peek out. Next door, a loud and rumbling 70s country squire-style pea-green station wagon with brown paneling was parked on the front lawn. A large white moving truck that displayed Speedy's Moving Company on the side of its trailer was parked in the driveway, providing the movers better access to move furniture into the garage. The driver's door of the pea-green station wagon opened, and there sat the hefty George Wallabee, a 44-year-old butcher by trade. He struggled to remove his stomach from behind the steering wheel and hoist himself from the car into a standing position. From the passenger door exited George's wife, Needy, a stay-at-home wife in desperate need of attention. From the back seat exited George and Needy's 3 children, their cute little 10-year-old daughter, Sophie, and their 2 sons, 16-year-old Reggie and 18-year-old Darwin. "Oh my God," Ceilia said slowly under her breath as she snooped on the family from her kitchen window next door as the Wallabees walked across the withered, dry brown grass and onto the stone slab walkway up to the front door. George walked over to the moving truck to instruct the moving team to be careful with certain vintage furniture pieces and items that had been marked fragile that needed to be stored carefully inside of the garage. "Please be careful with the chifforobe," said George. "I've had it for centuries. I mean, years." George corrected himself as a somewhat confused mover looked at George and said, "You got it, boss." George walked heavily up to the front door, where his anxious family curiously waited to explore the inside of the house. George reached in his pocket and pulled out the key, put it in the lock, and turned the doorknob. He pushed the door and it opened slowly with a needling, creaking noise that elicited unsettled expressions from Needy and the kids. Suddenly, a strong smell of mothballs filled their nostrils, and a disgusted Reggie said, "No way am I living in this stench, Dad." Darwin and Sophie frowned and nodded their heads in agreement of refusing to enter the house. Needy quickly intervened and said, "Look here, kids, we are all going to go inside and see what needs to be done. And whatever needs fixing, we're going to work together as a family and fix it. You got that?" The kids look at Needy, who can be quite firm in her approach with them at times, and all nod in agreement. The house was in disarray. Newspapers were thrown about the floor. The presumably once fluffy white carpet was now matted and tan-colored with yellow stains on it that were more than likely some sort of animal pee. The Wallabees spread out to observe each corner of the house. The kids all headed upstairs while George directed the movers to the garage to store all of the furniture until they could thoroughly clean and disinfect the entire house. Needy headed to the kitchen. She looked around, noticing dead flies on the countertop and dead-dried spiders near a side kitchen door that faced the neighbor's house directly across from their side kitchen door. Needy peeked out of the window on the side door and noticed what looked to be a pair of squinted eyes peering through the blinds next door. No sooner than she saw the eyes, they disappeared. In the kitchen next door, Ceilia closed her blinds just as soon as Needy's eyes met hers. "Oh, spit," murmured an embarrassed Ceilia. "I think she saw me." Celia's husband, Parker, angrily looked at her and said, "Oh, no, you don't, Ceilia, not again." Next door, Needy's eyes squinted with a slight uneasiness while she whispered under her breath, Upstairs, the kids were exploring the rooms of this musky house. As they climbed the stairs, they all heard what sounded like squeaking coming from one of the rooms down the hall. A brave and curious Sophie ran in the direction of the squeaking. Reggie and Darwin called out to her in a loud whisper saying, "Sophie, come back here," but she was already out of sight. The boys quickly followed and caught up to Sophie to see her standing in the corner room at the end of the hall, holding what looked to be a tiny mouse. "Look, I found a furry," said a smiling Sophie, as she adorably liked to call any animal with hair. A wide-eyed Darwin hurried over to Sophie. "Give it to me. I'll take it outside to get some fresh air," he requested, almost licking his lips. Sophie hesitantly gave the mouse to Darwin, and he hurried back down the hall, down the stairs, and out of the front door. An uneasy Sophie stood quietly for a second before a look of unease formed across her face, and she quickly chased after Darwin. She exited out the front door to see a smiling and satiated Darwin sitting on the curb in front of the house. "Hey, where's the furry?" Sophie questioned Darwin. "I released it into the bushes," responded Darwin as he let out a loud burp. A teary-eyed Sophie panicked and yelled, "I didn't see you release it into the bushes. Where is it?" Sophie ran to the bushes and began frantically looking for the mouse. "I don't see it anywhere," an irate Sophie exclaimed. Reggie hurried outside to see the tense confrontation between Darwin and Sophie. His eyes zeroed on Darwin. "What? I didn't do nothing," exclaimed Darwin upon seeing his younger brother leering at him. Reggie marched toward Darwin, furiously grabbed him by the arm, and angrily whispered in his ear, "I know you didn't just do what I think you did you?" Darwin glared at Reggie and snatched his arm away from him and quickly walked back inside the house. Reggie watched as his brother entered the house before heading over and placing a consoling hand on his baby sister's shoulder. George was in the garage directing the movers where to sit the chifforobe when all of a sudden he heard a masculine voice say, "Welcome, neighbor?" George quickly turned around and saw a balding man with glasses approaching with his hand outstretched. "I'm Parker, your neighbor. I live right next door. I saw your moving van and just wanted to come welcome you to the neighborhood and introduce myself." "Hey, thanks, I'm George," George responded while shaking his neighbor's hand and feeling a bit caught off guard by his neighbor's sudden forwardness. "It's kinda nice to see someone finally buy the old Peterson house. I mean, the Petersons lived here for many years and abruptly moved out one day without so much as a word to any of the neighbors," said a nervous, giggling Parker. "That was 5 years ago. Since then, the house has sat untouched without a renter or buyer." George looked curiously at Parker and responded, "That is certainly odd, I must agree." George sighed. "Hey, Parker, is it? How about coming to join us for our first barbecue, possibly this weekend when we get the house in order? We could introduce the families and have a few beers. How's that sound? I'll talk to my wife Needy and the kids, and we can have you and your family come join us. How's that?" Parker hesitated for a moment before saying, "My wife Ceilia will love having someone to talk to, that's for sure. And my son Kyle will be happy to have someone besides me to play video games with. Okay? Sounds good?" The two men laughed as they walked out of the garage and onto the driveway as they continued their conversation. Suddenly, everyone and everything froze in place. It was as if time itself stood still and left everyone frozen in place like statues. Well, everyone except for Soapy, who sat on the curb in front of the house crying her eyes out. "This may be a good time to tell you, but the Wallabees are no normal family. Oh no, you see, they are unearthly creatures, aliens, if you will. They've resided on a ruthless planet called Sorzo for hundreds of years. The inhabitants there are equipped with a variety of special powers so catastrophic that mere humans couldn't even begin to fathom the damage just one pissed-off Sorzonian is capable of. Even the most seemingly sweet and docile Sorzonian like Sophie. "I knew I shouldn't have given him the furry," exclaimed a regretful Sophie. "I knew he would eat it. He eats everyone's pet." Sophie took a deep breath and slowly calmed herself and wiped the tears from her eyes. She stood up, and with a wave of her pinky in the air, everyone was moving again. In the kitchen, Needy was cleaning up the dead flies and spiders when her heart skipped a beat upon realizing what had just happened. Needy lifted her right hand up to the right side of her temple and closed her eyes. With her mouth closed, her mind sent a message, "Everyone, meet me in the living room, now." In the backyard, Darwin gripped a baby bird in his hands with his mouth open wide, about to swallow it whole, but was halted immediately upon hearing Needy's message pierce his brain. Inside his chaotic-looking bedroom, Reggie waved his hand over the dirty carpet floor, seemingly making the grime disappear and restoring the carpet to new, but was abruptly interrupted from his chore when he received Needy's message. On the front lawn, Sophie happily observed a squirrel running along a tree branch, but up upon receiving Needy's message, she tensed up, fearing she may be the cause of the situation at hand. In the driveway, George and Parker were still locked in conversation as if nothing ever happened. But Needy's message is heard loud and clear. George quickly told Parker that he had to go help his wife with something in the kitchen and that he'd catch up with him at the barbecue. They parted with a handshake and Parker proceeded down the driveway and back to his house next door. George closed the garage and he and the kids swiftly joined Needy in the living room. Needy closed the old, torn, dark green curtains, then began quietly chanting a barrage of numbers and incantations in an unearthly tongue. Suddenly, a swirling circle of gray smoke began to appear in the center of the living room floor, and one by one they all stepped in the center of this swirling smoke disk and teleported to a new dimension. The Wallabees were now in a thick, black, smoke-like silhouette, standing on what looked like jagged black rocks. However, they no longer appear like the Wallabees that their neighbors had come to be familiar with. Oh no, they now appear to resemble something right out of your worst nightmare. Needy looked at George, who was moving about anxiously. His tentacles were flailing widely, while trying to keep his balance on these rocks due to his rather large size. His head was just a blob of loose flab with two large eyes dancing around in it. The Wallabees all closely resemble an octopus. This was their true form. Was it necessary to teleport us into the outer world? George frantically asked Needy. Yes, Needy quickly responded with a frightened tenor in her voice. We can't afford any more mistakes, Needy explained. Getting exiled from our home planet due to the irresponsibility of our children's abuse of their powers has totally uprooted our lives. Having to leave our family and friends behind has caused great pain. The first place I could think of was the outer world to regroup and have a family discussion just in case any of the Sorzonian government officials felt the freeze from Sophie and Pin pointed our location to further reprimand us for Sophie misusing her power once again here on Earth. But honey, the worst of the worst reside here. Other creatures that are so vicious here that I, myself, am afraid for us, responded an understandably confused George. Let's discuss and get the hell out of this place. The outer world was supposed to be a safe place that was created by the Sorzonian government for displaced aliens to calmly regroup and be able to reassemble when there is a family emergency or crisis. For us humans, a living room sofa area or a kitchen table would be a sufficient gathering place to reassemble. But for Sorzonians such as these, they felt that a place like the outer world was a safe place, but only to regroup and not to make their home. Those who stayed in the outer world too long would never be able to make it out. You see, the Wallabees were exiled because of their children's misuse and lack of restraint over their powers towards the other inhabitants, so they couldn't go back to their planet unless they were severely reprimanded. Now on Earth, they found themselves nestled in a quiet community on Cinder Block Road, where they finally found themselves welcomed. But now the Wallabees were in the outer world, a place where the most terrifying aliens, both in appearance and nature, resided. Needy slithered over the jagged black rocks and wrapped a tentacle around Sophie, and through mind communication asked her why she used her power after she was told never to use them without her consent. Sophie began to cry and was about to tell how Darwin ate her pet mouse when all of a sudden the ground started shaking. Aliens of every background and size started running in fear. Something very big and monstrous was coming, and whatever it was, it sent all of the other aliens in a panic. At that moment, the portal began closing to prevent whatever it was from escaping. George grabbed Sophie with one tentacle, then Needy, Reggie, and Darwin with his others, and started lurching towards the portal to make it out of the outer world and back home. George moved so fast that he lost his balance and fell off of one of the jagged rocks with a mighty thud, sending his family tumbling with him. They all looked up with terror in their eyes just in time to see the smoke from the portal subside and realized that they've just been trapped in the outer world. Reggie started reciting a series of numbers and incantations while spinning in wide circles. George and Needy watched in complete shock as Reggie, usually quiet and very reserved, was now shouting aloud an incantation in his family's native planetary tongue that to the human ear sounded like the numbers 5689, 9865, 2365, 5632. All of a sudden, a small black portal began to form right in the center of one of the black rocks that Reggie was standing on. The black swirling portal grew larger as Reggie chanted and spun. Suddenly, Reggie stretched out his tentacles, latched onto each one of his family members, and together they all huddled onto the growing portal and began to teleport back home. But something felt a little off as the portal tunnel seemed much darker than usual. Dazed and confused and frightened, the Wallabees arrived back inside of their living room. They had returned to human form, but were all covered in what appeared to be some sort of black goo with a foul stench. George exclaimed, "What the hell is this crap?" Needy looked horrified and quickly checked out the children, making sure that they were unharmed. Everyone's focus was now on Reggie, who immediately explained how he had studied for years on how to break the seal that trapped creatures in the outer world and teleport home if the portal ever closed. George hugged Reggie so tight that he nearly disappeared underneath his girth. "My son, the teleporting genius," George exclaimed. Needy and the rest of the family rushed over to Reggie and hugged him tightly with happy tears in their eyes. This went on until the Wallabees were just too tired to celebrate any further and could no longer stand to breathe the stench of this foul-smelling black goo. "What is this gross substance?" Needy exclaimed. "Showers, everyone," she ordered. The Wallabees all made a beeline straight to the showers. Later that night, Reggie, happy and excited to be back home, lay in bed fresh from his shower. His eyes bulged, and he sat up as he suddenly realized that he forgot to close the portal. He jumped out of bed and ran downstairs. He noticed a thick black goo next to the small swirling black smoke ring in the center of the floor. Not wanting to disturb the family, Reggie kneeled down near the portal and quietly chanted his incantation, 4-6-5-7-7-5-6-4-3908-8039. The portal slowly closed. With the portal shut, Reggie noticed the black goo on the floor. He ran and grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer to shine some light on just exactly where the goo was around the living room. The smell of rotted flesh filled all of downstairs, and Reggie started to feel uneasy. He rushed back up the stairs and into his room and quickly got back in bed. Reggie's eyes slowly began to close, and the ragged curtain that hung sideways on his window looked awfully strange. Yet Reggie's eyes began to drift as they opened and closed. Every time they opened, the room seemed blacker and blacker until the blackness engulfed the entire room, causing Reggie to stretch his eyes open as far as possible, but still unable to see anything at all. Reggie sat up in his bed and realized that he smelled something resembling a rotting corpse. "Darwin!" Reggie called his brother in the next room, but got no response. All of a sudden, he saw a large black shadow move closer to his bed and heard a deep and hellish voice say, "Reggie, the portal genius. Ha 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 ha." "Help!" Reggie yelled. "Something got through." A horrified Reggie shook in bed as he looked into the silver glowing eyes of what looked to be an 8-foot slimy black monster with black fermented goo dripping from its face. Reggie quickly recited his incantation and immediately teleported into his parents' room. He dove headfirst onto the bed yelling, "Mom, Dad, something came back with us." George jumped up in bed and clicked on the lamp on the nightstand beside him. Without a second thought, Needy jumped out of bed and tore out of the room and up the stairs to retrieve Sophie, who was still sleeping sound in her bed. "Darwin!" Needy yelled when all of a sudden a blood-curdling scream was heard coming from Darwin's room. George makes his way to Darwin's room and sees that his door is closed tight and that foul black goo is smeared across it. George bashes the door down while transforming into his natural form. George is shocked and infuriated as he sees a giant 8-armed beast covered in black goo that appeared most similarly to an anglerfish attempting to swallow Darwin whole. George wrapped one tentacle around the beast and with another pulled his son from its mouth at the same time. George's grip was so strong that it began crushing the beast, forcing it to release Darwin. The beast struggled under George's massive, ever-powerful, vice-like grip. The creature started to produce more bubbling masses of thick, black, putrid goo and was able to slide down towards the floor and out of George's death grip. But George refused to give up and was frantically grasping at the creature, but unable to maintain a tight grip as his tentacles kept sliding off. The creature began to laugh and moved toward Reggie, while mocking him, saying, "Reggie the portal genius, give me your power and I'll let you live." At that moment, Sophie stretched out her tiny hand, and with a wave of her pinky, and once again, everyone and everything froze. Terrified and desperate to help her family, Sophie zoomed down the stairs and out the front door, across the dry grass and onto her neighbor's front porch. Sophie screamed and cried while she banged on the front door. 15-year-old Kyle opened the door to see a distraught Sophie crying and pleading for help. In a panic, Kyle yelled out for Ceilia and Parker. Ceilia and Parker hurried to the front door where Sophie was crying frantically and completely inconsolable. Ceilia Greedly kneeled down and placed a consoling hand on Sophie's shoulder and hugged her ever so gently. "Where's your mom?" Ceilia asked Sophie. Before Sophie could get a word out, Parker ran out of the front door with Kyle right behind him. Mistakenly, Sophie extended her pinky, moving it in a circular motion as Ceilia hugged her tight, trying to calm her down, accidentally causing the freezing spell to break. Ceilia helped Sophie into the living room, getting her situated on the couch. She handed the traumatized Sophie a glass of water, turned on the television to cartoons. "Stay right here and I'll go get your mommy," reassured Ceilia as she walked out the front door of her house. Parker rushed through the Wallabees' house through the open front door, and he spotted the giant beast. Its large fangs were exposed with black goo dripping from its mouth as it closed in on a weakened and injured George as he still stood ready to fight to protect his family. Upon witnessing the creature, instead of fear, there was all-out fury and disdain on Parker's face. "Another feeder," Parker said with disgust. Parker then put his hand up to the right side of his head and telepathically said to Ceilia, "Hurry, honey, and bring the extras." The creature instantly directed his attention towards Parker. "How do you know what I am, human?" it inquired. Parker looked calm and gave an evil grin, then stepped aside, revealing that Ceilia now stood in the doorway. Suddenly, Celia's body began to duplicate itself. First 2, then 3, now 4. Every new Ceilia was more hideous and vicious than the last. Each new form was more muscular and massive in size. The upper torso, arms, and head were adorned with thorns the size of rhinoceros horns. Suddenly, laughter became hysteria as Celia's demons began to emerge and take over each of her hideous forms. "Quick, take cover!" Parker yelled to George. George looked terrified at the creatures that Ceilia produced that were more horrifying than the beast that terrorized his family. The beast growled, displaying rows of teeth so pronounced that it would intimidate a great white shark. The beast was even more terrified than the Wallabees, as it recognized with certainty the dangerous monster that Ceilia was. The beast turned to run, but collapsed to the floor at the sound of a loud crunching noise. Parker and the Wallabees watched as one of the extras stood and chewed on the beast's right leg as thick black goo dripped from its sharp teeth. Another extra proceeded to wiggle across the floor in the most obscene demonic way as the now one-legged beast tried to avoid it by attaching itself to the ceiling and begging for its life. However, another loud crunch and one of the creature's massive arms was being devoured by another extra. Suddenly, the other two large extras with the rhinoceros horns jumped up on the ceiling and opened their mouths, exposing rows and rows of 12-inch thick fangs. The creature then became ground beef inside of a monstrous wood chipper as the extras devoured it. The Wallabees were underneath the dining room table, shaking uncontrollably at what they just witnessed. Parker then used mind telepathy to the first Ceilia to reabsorb the extras. Ceilia began to absorb the rest of the extras back into her body like a sponge absorbed water. Parker and Kyle emerged from behind the couch and told the Wallabees that everything was okay and it was safe for them to come out from underneath the dining room table. Ceilia stood next to a disheveled Parker. Parker looked at the frightened Wallabees and said, "I'm so sorry you had to find out about us this way. You see, we're originally from the planet Gulaw, but were exiled because Ceilia used her powers and devoured some cruel bastard from our neighborhood that we found out had kidnapped and killed her twin sister. The Gulaw government saw Ceilia as too dangerous and exiled us to the outer world. Ceilia was the thing that aliens and monsters hid from in the outer world. One day, the portal was left open, and we escaped, never to return to that God-forsaken place." Ceilia walked over to Needy and the family and hugged each one of them tightly and peacefully said, "You're safe here, Needy. Let's go get your little girl."